Gracias, Julio. Bueno, buenas tardes. Voy a maximizar la presentación. Yo lo voy a hacer en inglés por comodidad, porque ya parte de la presentación ya la tenía, así que bueno, después ya en el debate ya podemos hablar de lo que queréis. Good afternoon. I wanted to start by thanking the organization of the seminar for this opportunity to participate and for putting in the effort of making the seminar in hybrid format so we can participate remotely. As we were discussing before, I am truly sorry for not being able to be there in Vitoria, but I have recently become a mother. And I must confess that I grossly overestimated the amount of work and sleep I would be able to get while on maternity leave. This brings me to my second point, which is an apology. I was very optimistic when I submitted the abstract for the seminar, but in reality, I was not able to develop the presentation in accordance with what I was hoping to do. So this perhaps is going to go a little bit like this. However, I really hope that at least for the written version of the paper, I will be able to compensate. So please bear with me. I have structured the presentation of this in these three main points. So I will start by presenting the case study of Castelo de Vidro, which many of you already know, and it's already been published. I will focus on the main results and hypotheses relating to the social practices and the concept of peasant agency. And I will finish with just some ideas, more likely glimpses into what I wish I could have developed in more detail, but I couldn't, and that I really hope we can discuss during the debate. So my presentation will focus on the material evidence of early medieval rural settlements recovered via archaeology. In October of 2022, there was an initial seminar at the start of the Sokolok project. The goal of that meeting was to discuss theoretical frameworks, case studies, and methodologies to evaluate the extent to which it was useful to work within the concept of local communities. There were some questions that were raised back then, and it might be useful to have a look at them before starting my presentation, as they also summarize some of the key challenges of trying to infer social practices from the archaeological record. And these are: how can we interpret apparently homogeneous and horizontal material records in light of social political complexity? How is it possible to combine logic or family-based productive practices with the existence of local community? How can we recognize possible scales of suprafamilial interaction? And in the end, what of these practices and dynamics can promote the development of identities at the local level? And in the end, how can we see them, or if you can see them, through archaeology? As you might have guessed by now, there are several things in common with the type of settlements and inherent problems that Carlos Terrarizo presented yesterday. These are similar contexts. Here you can see the location of Castelo de Vidro within the region of Alto Alentejo in central Portugal, near the border with Extremadura. While there is a small mountain range, Serra de São Mamed, most of the areas that were occupied during the early medieval period were pen plains with gentle slopes, like these ones you see in the pictures. There are mainly granitic soils with transition to schist in the north, which are very exceeded, meaning that it is difficult to preserve organic remains in the archaeological contexts. As we can see from this map, the archaeological reality of rocket graves is a very common phenomenon in this region, particularly in the northern part of Alto Alentejo. The reason our research started in Castelo de Vidro is because there were several previous works that suggested that early medieval settlements were preserved here. Municipal surveys carried out in the 90s systematically identified rocket graves, but also remains of different types of buildings, stone walls, and elements of press facilities. There were some results from previous excavations, but they lacked clear stratigraphic sequences or had been carried out mainly in schist graves. Thanks to the support of the municipality, we were able to excavate seven settlements, and we also re-examined previous excavation in the light of our findings. In this drawing, you can see that the stratigraphic sequence of these early medieval sites is truly quite simple. On the surface level, it's possible to see the top of the stone wall remains. Then, after removing the first sediment layer, we identify the collapse levels of the walls, and after that, the collapse level of roof tiles. The floor was mostly made of compact earth, and it's on top of this layer that objects are preserved. There is no evidence of destructive processes. On the contrary, all the households we have analyzed preserve evidence of a very slow decay, And in terms of household assemblages, it seems that they were abandoned with many of the day-to-day objects still inside. Evidence gathered so far includes settlements composed of domestic buildings, press facilities for olive oil and wine, and small family gravesites. We will now see some examples. This was the first site we excavated. It's the remains of a farmstead. There is a central rectangular structure with two compartments, which was the main household living space. And then there are also these two outside circular walls that enclose the outer areas. They have remains. This could function both as cattle pens and enclosures associated to the farm. On the inside, we have remains of domestic pottery, a fireplace, and work areas. Here you can also see how close to the rocket grave the structure actually is. This is a general view from the excavation facing north. Those two larger stones you can see in the back is the main entrance. This is another structure which was not excavated in its totality, but we did a test pit inside, and it also presented the remains of a fireplace, domestic pottery, and several fragments of kernstones. Notably, around this house, there are a total of 9 rocket graves, 6 of which were under 1 meter in length, and most likely intended for children. Here is that same excavation facing west. You can see that both the rocky outcrop and packed earth pavement were used as ground floor here. At this site, the smaller trench revealed the remains of a screw press mechanism. There is a large building with 2 compartments and 2 entrances inside. There is a ground level hearth, and we recovered over 700 kilos of shards from large ceramic storage vessels, like this one in the picture. So this was likely a storage building associated with the press. 2 charcoal samples identified on the first collapse level of the roof were radiocarbon dated, indicated that by the first half of the 8th century, this structure was likely abandoned. This is coherent with the additional 4 radiocarbon dates obtained so far in other buildings. In 2022, we did an additional excavation around the pressway, hoping to recover the whole building. Unfortunately, it was very poorly preserved. However, we were able to recover more shards of large ceramic vessels associated to the press, some of them heavily decorated, like this on the picture, and most importantly, carbonized grape seeds. Here we have another example of a lever and screw press facility. In this case, it was possible to excavate the whole building with the press weight still inside. You can see it was probably just slightly dislocated from its original location. We believe that someone tried to remove it and then gave up in the middle of the process. More importantly, we also have the pressing surface preserved in the left part. And it's very interesting because it presents a coating very similar to the Roman opus igninum, a bit of poorer quality. It is also worth noting that the granite press weight has 2 different moments of use, 2 different pairs of notches, likely because the first moment of use, one of the notches broke, as you can see in the drawing. And so it was necessary to do, again, other 2 notches to keep using the same weight. This is actually a type of poor granite. It's not very concise. It's very granito de grano grosso. So here you can see the excavation area of the building. The press was intentionally built in a natural down slope to take advantage of the difference in height between the area for pressing and the location of the weight. This enhances the way the lever can work. And this is also a very interesting site, this same site with the press, because in most of the cases of the settlements we have analyzed, the rocket graves appear in groups of 2 or 3 or in a dispersed fashion. Here at Junçal, there is a group of 9 graves and an additional 2 burials north. It is not clear if this burial area reflects a concentrated settlement pattern or rather a settlement that was used for a longer period of time, as the structures themselves seem to be more concentrated when compared to other sites. We also have examples of rocket lever and screw presses, like this one in Alcogulo. In these cases, where we see the remains of a wall, the press structure was likely originally enclosed, totally or partially, but due to erosive processes, the outer walls were not preserved. Where there's marked D, we also have 2 rock-cut graves very close to the press facility. There are also other examples of more simple structures, some of which might have worked with prensas de bastidor directo, like the ones Maria Valero presented yesterday, and others that might have been simply used for grade threading, tapisar laugo. Or, I think it was Marga that said yesterday, they might not have anything to do with wine production at all, and be simply used to feed animals, collect water, and many other uses. These other uses for the structures is an issue that we also must keep in mind when we are doing surface field surveys related to these sorts of settlements. Also the possibility that they are not even early medieval and they are just remains from other more recent structures. In this context, it's really important to stress the relevance of identifying early medieval press facilities that were being used to produce wine and oil of oil. We have a specific paper where we argue this, but in broad terms, on the one hand, we have evidence that the knowledge about how to build and operate these complex press mechanisms was maintained during the early medieval period, and that many new facilities were built. On the other hand, the number and size of these presses suggests a production that goes beyond the needs of individual families and most likely reflected a surplus production at household level. The fact that both olive oil and wine were not basic census commodities suggests that these productions could be used for superlocal trade or, more likely, as a possible form of tax payment. Turning now to the building techniques, all the buildings analyzed were built with stone materials, double-faced walls, heterogeneous blocks and slabs, sometimes repurposed materials that are filled with a mixture of stones and earth without mortar. The buildings present a sort of modular construction, and we can also see slight differences between the buildings according to their function. The press facilities were larger and of most robust construction, and they have more than one access from the outside. You can see those at the left compared to the houses that are slightly smaller. In this regard, while it is appealing to consider the possibility of peasant agency expressed through the construction of buildings with common features, as Carlos suggested yesterday, I would also like to point out the possibility that some of these features, namely the modular construction, were at least in part conditioned to the characteristics of the available building materials, in this case, granitic stones and slabs that were extracted directly in quarries near the sites. It is because of this that there are several examples of ethnographic rural buildings from the modern and contemporary period that share characteristics with the early medieval ruins, as we can see in this farmstead, which has lost its housing function, but is still nowadays used for gathering sheep and goat. Pottery production identified in these settlements is very heterogeneous, both in terms of formal variety and the technical aspects of the production. The use of the potter wheel is very limited, and most vessels were likely fired in simple structures such as open fires or pits. This process suggests that most of the pottery production was carried out by the households themselves and that there were no specialized pottery workshops. The exception to this, however, would be the large storage vessels and the roof tiles, which were more technically demanding. These vessels were recovered from the schist graves, but they can give an idea of the type of ceramic containers that are usually recovered in the domestic structures. Here you can see a side-by-side picture of a pitcher from a schist grave and another recovered from the press facility of Ronsal. You can see they are quite similar. For this part, the roof tiles identified in the early medieval settlements are very similar in terms of size, shape, and production techniques. We believe this suggests that there was original production and distribution of ceramic building materials. There is also evidence to suggest that some limited iron work was carried out in these peasant settlements and a very reduced number of glass and bronze objects. In regard to the land use system, considering the number of settlements that were likely functioning simultaneously, building features, and the size and location of the areas disoccupied, it is feasible to assume that this was mainly an extensive agricultural system based on small farmsteads. So based on these results from the excavations, we now have a clear picture of what types of material remains can be used to identify early medieval settlements. This in turn allows us to carry out intensive field surveys in specific areas and offer a clear picture of how the living spaces were organized. It is very clear the spatial relationship between buildings, the green squares, graves, the red dots, and press facilities, the yellow triangles. It is also an example of an area with a particularly high density of surfaced finds. So far, our analysis has allowed us to characterize the emergence of a new settlement pattern in the countryside in the post-Roman centuries, revealing evidence of small family-managed farmsteads, the coexistence of different productive scales for everyday objects, olive oil and wine, and the existence of limited prestige goods, the glass and bronze objects, allows us to place these communities into horizontal and vertical relationships. But in this context, social structures remain somewhat elusive, and new questions arise about the early medieval countryside. Who lived in these houses, and how many people, and for how long? Were settlements built simultaneously or in close succession? By whom? Were the inhabitants members of the same family or close acquaintances? What was the degree of autonomy of these families to choose where and how to build new houses? And what about the press facilities? Was the olive oil or wine production managed locally? Who was demanding these products? In what process could different domestic units function as a local community? And also, can different forms of landscape, settlement layouts, dwelling features, and material culture be related to social structures? Is it possible to consider a European frame of reference to analyze this? These were some of the questions that I was hoping to develop in the written version of the paper. So starting to conclude, I just wanted to say that one of the new sets of evidence that we have been analyzing in Alto Alentejo are the post-Roman faces of old villas. This analysis is particularly challenging because most of the excavations carried out at these sites are quite old. The excavation methodology is not always clear, and oftentimes the record is poor. But for now, what strikes the most is that, for one part, there is evidence of singular materials, as is the case of Mascarro, where 2 Visigothic tremisses were identified, although they are now missing. Grave sites composed of schist graves are also very common at the villas, with grave goods very similar to the material culture identified in the new early medieval settlements previously presented. It is also in these types of settlements, in sites such as Torre de Palma in Montfort, that we have evidence for new basilicas and baptisteries, material evidence that suggests that at least some of these sites could be interpreted as living areas of early medieval elites. But on the other hand, many of the post-Roman contexts that are identified in old villas seem to reflect less durable structures with more evidence of buildings constructed in perishable materials. This could be simply a matter of archaeological visibility or due to different types of formation process, but it's a matter that deserves closer attention. Additionally, while there are clear instances in which Roman villas are still being occupied during the post-Roman period, there is also a clear process of recycling of Roman building materials, which are reused or repurposed in early medieval features. While there was certainly an economic necessity in this reuse process, we could also inquire about the ideological concerns behind these processes, the active choice they imply, and even the possible symbolical capital behind both these old sites and these materials. These are some of the things I hope we can develop for next time. Thank you.